Hey friends, how are you? I'm supposed to do this every day, but yesterday I skipped because I had a very full day. But I'm back and here to speak to you. And the conversation is about the election. As I've said to many people who've asked me, Kamala, the Don. 6 on one hand, half a dozen on the other. It depends on which elixir you choose to swallow. Remember, when Kamala said, we're just going to move forward, that means she's going to move forward with the Biden administration's, I guess, tasks for America. And then you've got Donald, on the other hand, who wants to completely rewrite everything about elections, everything about the federalists versus the anti-federalists. He just wants to totally rearrange everything so that he won't have to be elected again, but he will be coronated into the office of the presidency. Okay. Also remember that when Oprah had Kamala on and someone said, what are you going to do for the working class? Kamala had no answer because, as she said before, they're just going to move forward. So who is the president of the United States, really? Well, let me get to your questions. Someone asked me a question about the loss of voting rights and the cases. I got another question about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I got another question about when blacks were actually allowed to vote. So this is all my expertise. I might as well talk about it. What the heck? Now, let's start with the DMV. DMV, you would think in Jersey it means the Division of Motor Vehicles. However, in America, it means Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Let's talk about those 3 states for a minute. I don't know if you know, but by 1803, definitely by 1805, America said it's not bringing in any more slaves, right? However, those states that were on the border, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, etc., all the way out to California, all those that were on the, I think it's 36 degrees north, 36 latitude, which is, the Mason-Dixon line, all those states didn't have to give up slavery. In fact, it's alleged that Maryland had slave quarters on its eastern shore up until the 90s. What is true is Maryland became the Wall Street of the slave trade after it was deemed that America should not be taking any more slaves. And wow, how interesting has that been? People I know who moved to places like Delaware and Maryland are shocked at how racist the areas actually are because they don't present that. But you have to remember, if you go to Delaware, where there are more Klan per square mile than in Mississippi, if you go to Maryland, where they were the, as I said, the Wall Street of the slave trade, and then Virginia, of course, did not let blacks and whites marry until the 70s because they really didn't take off their books that blacks who were formerly enslaved weren't human. That's the DMV. That's who's representing you. Let's move on. How did the Voting Rights Act fall apart? First of all, it's only an act. It's so funny. Macbeth, Act 1, center stage, Macbeth, 3 witches stirring the pot. An act is an act. That's all it is. It's not a law. It's not mandated. It's just an act. It's something that you do. And let's see what happens. So, during the worst parts of slavery, during the worst parts of Reconstruction, during the worst parts of the uprises when it came to civil rights, what they found was that it was very important that blacks vote. So what did they do? They had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed in by whom? Johnson. And what did Johnson say to Martin Luther King? You have that great scene where he hands the pen over and he says something to Martin Luther King. What did he say to Martin Luther King? He said, listen, Martin. Listen, Martin. He said, by 1982, the Southern Democrats, let me say that again, the Southern Democrats will more than likely be amenable to having voting rights for blacks. But I'm just going to sign this act until 1982, and I'm sure the country will be much further down the road by 1982. Interesting. So 1982 came. Who was in office? Ronald Reagan. Great guy. People loved him. He was like a grandpa to people. What did he do with the Voting Rights Act? Signed it for another 25 years. And then what happened? 25 years later, 2007. Who was in office then? W. He was a great president. Very funny. He's very close with the Obamas. What did he do? He signed it again for another 25 years. So this act was never made law. It was signed in as an act. It was never reconstructed as an executive order. It was never reconstructed as a law. It's just an act. Interesting. So I assumed, when you assume, you make an ass out of yourself and others. I assumed that a guy like Obama, who is a constitutionalist, an expert on the Constitution, I expected him to some way or another either write an executive order or press that all states would equally allow blacks to vote. Now, why did I say states? Well, let's get to one of my questions. Someone was like, well, Dr. Brockett, I heard that blacks were able to vote since 1870. Correcto mundo. 1870. The 15th Amendment was formed in 1870, and that allowed blacks to vote on the federal level. But I live in New York. I don't live in the federal of New York. You may live in Maryland. You don't live in the federal of Maryland. You may live in Massachusetts. You don't live in the federal of Massachusetts. You live in the Commonwealth. You live in the state. You live in the state. So wait, why is this giving my mind major cognitive dissonance? Well, because it could easily give voting rights to blacks on the federal level, but not the state level, which meant you could vote for your president. That's why so many blacks loved Roosevelt. So many blacks were behind who? The Republicans, including Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Republican. Why? Because historically, you had presidential candidates making all kinds of promises. Sound familiar? Making all kinds of promises of freedom, land ownership, all that. Okay. Well, that was it. And each state had to ratify its own constitution to allow people of color to vote. Now, why is it a big deal? Well, because in those southern states, the electoral college states, it was a big deal. Somebody asked me about the electoral college. Let me throw this one out at you for a moment. The electoral college is based upon the 3/5 compromise. Let me say it again. The electoral college, its power to vote, is based in the 3/5 compromise. Well, what was that? Well, when Lincoln ran, the southern whites were upset because, let's say there were 4 million whites and they owned 6 million slaves, which meant that there was less voting power when it came to the North. Okay? So what did they do? They said, okay, we will give you all a vote and 3/5 because your slave is 3/5 of a person. Remember, slaves in this country were 3/5 people. That's why the, major documents, we the people, the Constitution, didn't apply to blacks because blacks weren't human. Okay. So, still to this very minute, the 3/5 compromise The 3/5 of a person thing. I live in New York. You hear this all the time. It's like nonstop. Anyway, the 3/5 compromise said that blacks, if you're white, you get a vote and 3/5. That's why it's so powerful. That's why they ignore the popular vote. That's why I question anyone who's loved too much by the Democrats. Did I say that aloud? TV timeout. I'm only saying that for two reasons. One, the mayor of New York, Eric Adams. Two, the hip-hop mogul, Diddy. Let me just give you a little example, then I'll get back. Eric Adams was doing a lot for the city, and then all of a sudden 100,000, 200,000 immigrants were shipped up from Texas, and we somehow had to fit them in these 5 boroughs or upstate. He pled to the Democrats, of which he is one. He pled to the president, who's a Democrat, who we voted for, to please help, because no one was helping. When he made that battle cry, all of a sudden, he was in trouble. Diddy may be a hoe, okay? Allegedly, maybe a hoe. But Diddy was about to have a tequila line. All that advertising he was doing for, that liquor company, he was doing that, and it was supposed to be a quid pro quo. I give, you take, I give, back and forth. But what happened? As soon as he said, I want to have generational wealth for my family, those 7 words, they came after him. You don't think that Hollywood has been having crazy sex parties and crazy drugs and crazy drugging up women and having sex with them, et cetera, et cetera? You don't think that America's been doing that? America been doing that. Same thing with Bill Cosby. When he went out to own NBC, all hell broke loose in his life. I can give a personal example. My last name is Brockett. It's an internationally royal last name. My last name is spelled with 2 T's. How is it internationally royal? Well, I have a curtain that I'm trying to hold back here. When the Ghanaians, the people from Ghana, the Ghanaians, keep it in your head, when the Ghanaians sold my great-great-great-great-grandmother to Lord William Brockett, a Scottish lord coming out of Scotland, having been crowned by the Queen. They're in southeast Scotland. Well, they owned spices in Jamaica. And what did they do? They got slaves from the west coast of Africa to bring and work, right? For them. Now, I told you about the slave trade, though. I told you America wasn't supposed to be doing that anymore, right? Okay. Anyway, so, and I have to tell you one other thing. 93% of the Africans who ended up in Jamaica as slaves were sold by the Ghanaians. When you go to Ghana, they're huge slave castles. Huge. Okay? And you'll ask a guy, what are those slave castles for? Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's what they'll say. They don't know. Really? Yeah. Anyway, so my great-great-great-great-grandmother must have been hot, because Lord William Brockett, with 1 T, had many children with her. And when they left Jamaica, they left the land to their black offspring who have their name with a 2nd T. Absolutely. Why am I even telling you this? Well, when my great-great-grandfather came to America, he was born in 1857. They got rid of slavery in Jamaica in 1833, which meant that he was born free. And he was the grandson of a Scottish lord, Brockett. Came to America in about somewhere in the 1870s, mid to late, and he started buying land. Extremely long story short, that land has been in our family in Virginia Beach since 1880. A large portion of it was recently sold off, but it made people mad. Why am I telling this story? Because the Ashkenaz family that came after me to rip me down found out that I wasn't a typical black. So they wanted to teach me a lesson. All this stuff is about teaching people lessons. Okay, I'll put that down. Now, you understand that the Voting Rights Act of 1865 was merely an act. You understand that the voting rights given by the 15th Amendment only allowed blacks to vote on the federal level, not the state level. And for the last thing, let's talk about how the vote was lost. First, I want to just remind you about a case called Strouder versus West Virginia, which was decided in 1870, which interestingly is the same year that they came down with the 15th Amendment and said, hey, blacks can vote, but on a federal level. Well, let me tell you how Strouder versus West Virginia, federal, a case coming from the United States Supreme Court, how it defined blacks. The question in that case was, well, can the newly freed slave vote? Okay, so they deliberated. Justice Brown wrote the major opinion, and in the opinion, this is what he said about the newly freed slaves and the blacks in America. Although they are abject, ignorant, childlike, and unfit. Abject, ignorant, childlike, and unfit. They will allow them to be on the jury. How interesting. Those words have never been overturned. Strouder versus West Virginia was cited in cases as close as the early 2000s to the mid 2000s. It's the law, and it defines the black voter. So let's look at this. Of course, during the uprisings, civil uprisings, black folk couldn't vote because the districts were drawn in such a way that whites would have the advantage. So they decided to redraw the districts. Now, that helped with the national black vote. That helped with the vote for the President of the United States. So what happened? In 1993, Janet Reno was the Attorney General. And there was a case that came before the Supreme Court, called Shaw versus Reno. It was all about a case in North Carolina where people felt their vote wasn't being heard, and because of how the districts were drawn. And the beauty of the Voting Rights Act was, understand my word, was that if they saw that there was unjust voting practices like redrawing of districts, people having to wait for hours in line to vote, that sort of thing, people used to be able to go directly to the United States Attorney General. Well, in 2013, 20 years later, under the presidency of Barack Obama, and under the auspices of the office of the Attorney General being run by Eric Holder, another case came out in North Carolina called Shelby County versus Holder. That was versus Holder because he's the AG, and people are allowed to go to the AG if there's a voting practice which isn't right. So a white guy from North Carolina said, hey, wait a minute, I'm not getting my vote in because they redrew this, so my vote, this isn't fair. How is this fair? We've got a black president. How is this fair? Well, he won. And why did he win? And why were voting rights stripped after he won? Why were people marching for voting rights back in 2013, 14, 15 up to the present? Why? I thought, many people I thought we took care of that back in 1965. No, it wasn't taken care of. It was merely an act. Like the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a proclamation. I proclaim that I'm going to sit in the sun today and talk to you guys. That's my proclamation. My act was putting my little cell phone up here so that we could carry on a conversation. Okay. Okay. So what was the logic behind getting rid of the right to vote? What was the logic behind that? Well, and Holder argued this because Barack was in office. We are now a race-neutral society. We are now beyond race, they said. Why are we beyond race? Because we have a black president. So, when you sit down to vote, think about this. Kamala says, we're just going to move forward. In other words, more of the same. Donald says, we're going to rip up the Constitution and start all over again. You have a choice. Which evil is going to work for you?